What if royalty didn't mean elegance, but execution? What if crowns didn't shine, they bled? Behind every jeweled throne is a darker story, where kings ruled like tyrants, queens silenced nations, and emperors crushed millions in the name of legacy. These weren't fairy tale rulers. These were the architects of fear, betrayal, and brutality. From golden palaces to blood-stained courts, history has crowned its share of monsters. And tonight, we open the royal vault. This is 30 most evil royals in history, where power corrupts and the crown never comes off clean. Before we dive in, if you love unraveling the darker corners of history, make sure to subscribe for more tales that you definitely won't find in your school textbook. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? We know some of you hit play at midnight, and honestly, that's the perfect hour for this kind of story. 1. King Leopold II of Belgium. He styled himself the Builder King, but that's not what they called him in the Congo. There he was the ghost behind the curtain, the man whose name was whispered with the kind of bitterness reserved for those who smile while holding the knife. In Belgium, he built gardens. In the Congo, he built graves. King Leopold II never formally conquered a colony. That would have been too honest. Instead, he acquired one as a private citizen, a feat that sounds absurd until you realize how absurdly powerful he was. In 1885, under the pretense of philanthropy and civilization, he convinced the world to grant him personal ownership of the Congo Free State. Not Belgium, not a government, just Leopold, as if he were buying a mansion. And like a mansion, he filled it with resources. Ivory first, then rubber, but rubber doesn't fall off trees ready to export. It comes from vines. It sticks to skin. It requires labor, and Leopold's solution to that problem was one of the most terrifying private police systems in history, the Force Publique, part army, part terror squad, and entirely funded by the suffering of the people they controlled. Villages were burned for underproducing. Families held hostage until quotas were met, and if they weren't, hands were cut off, not always from the guilty. Sometimes a soldier would shoot at random, then return with a severed limb to prove they hadn't wasted a bullet. A million tiny lies piled into a mountain of horror. Leopold never saw it, never touched it. His hands remained gloved and ceremonial. From his ornate palace in Brussels, he managed a machine of exploitation that led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million Congolese. 10 million. That's not governance. That's industrial-scale evil, and he did it all with plausible deniability, like a man who turns his back on the dog he ordered to attack. Back in Belgium, he was admired, lauded for public works. Streets were named after him, statues erected. He poured Congo's blood money into Belgian marble, creating the illusion of a benevolent monarch. You can still walk past his monuments today, some bearing vague plaques, others silently enduring the glares of passers-by who know better now. When international pressure finally mounted, due in large part to missionaries and journalists who refused to look away, Leopold didn't apologize. He sold the Congo to the Belgian state for a handsome sum. Yes, he sold people again. He died a year later, mourned by many of his citizens who wept without knowing or pretending not to know why his hands were so clean. Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it signs documents in gold ink and attends ribbon cuttings. Sometimes it speaks French, sips wine, and funds hospitals with one hand while strangling a continent with the other. And if you think that's as bad as monarchy gets, wait until you meet a Tsar who believed his own paranoia was divine will, a man whose nickname became a prophecy, because next we meet Ivan the Terrible. 2. Ivan IV. Even the Terrible of Russia. There are bad rulers, there are mad rulers, and then there's Ivan IV of Russia, a man so consumed by fear, rage, and sanctified delusion that he didn't just rule a kingdom, he scorched it from the inside out. Ivan was the first to be called Tsar of all Rus, and he made sure the title meant something terrifying. Crowned at age 16 in a display of divine symbolism, he presented himself as God's chosen sovereign. Russia, he declared, was no longer merely a realm, it was a fortress of faith, and he its grim gatekeeper. But Ivan didn't start out terrible, he started out terrified. Orphaned young, raised among the scheming boyars, Russia's feudal aristocrats, Ivan learned early that trust was a liability. He watched people smile while poisoning each other's cups. He witnessed courtiers vanish overnight. He grew up in the echo chamber of a royal court where loyalty was transactional and affection a myth. So when Ivan came of age, he repaid the world exactly what it had taught him: cruelty wrapped in ceremony. After a few early reforms, the kind historians love to mention to soften the blow, he unleashed a new form of monarchy built not on governance but on fear. His crowning creation, the Oprichnina, a black-clad paramilitary force loyal only to him. They were part secret police, part death cult, part religious procession, riding through the streets like monks of vengeance. Their job: to purify the land, or, more accurately, to silence it. Under the Oprichnina's shadow, entire towns were emptied. Aristocrats were accused of treason in trials where the verdict always came first. Ivan believed everyone was plotting against him, and rather than disprove the conspiracy, he decided to make it true by punishing even the innocent until treason became the only rational response. One infamous episode involved the city of Novgorod. Ivan, convinced the city would defect to Poland, ordered a campaign of repression so severe it bled into legend. The population was ravaged, not by foreign invaders, but by their own ruler, marching in like an executioner disguised as a priest. Clergy were targeted, families were erased, and Ivan, he prayed, he fasted, he wept afterward, as though regret could baptize cruelty into righteousness. But perhaps nothing reveals the mind of Ivan quite like what happened to his own son. In a moment of rage, some say misunderstanding, some say long gestating madness, Ivan struck his heir in a fit of anger. The Tsarevich died days later. And Russia lost more than a man that day. It lost the fragile line between control and chaos. Ivan reportedly wept at his son's deathbed, begging forgiveness from a body that could no longer hear him. A nation watched as the Tsar cradled the consequences of his own tyranny. He died in 1584 on the chessboard of all places. A final irony for a man who treated his entire kingdom like a game of calculated sacrifices. And yet Russia would never fully bury Ivan. His legacy survived in fear, in autocracy, in the lingering belief that power must always come wrapped in punishment. He left behind a country broken by suspicion and held together with violence, a shape that would repeat itself again and again, from dynasty to dictatorship. But if Ivan weaponized fear, the next royal used chaos as a stage. Imagine a man who sang while Rome burned, a man who rewrote the rules of power as theater. Because up next is Emperor Nero, the performer, the poet, and possibly the most dangerous narcissist ever to hold a laurel crown. 2 royals in, and already history's looking less like a crown and more like a crime scene. If you're still with us, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Late night listeners, we see you. This only gets darker. 3. Emperor Nero of Rome. There are emperors who conquer with legions. There are emperors who build roads, reform laws, and stabilize the realm. And then there's Nero, who played music while history burned. Or so the story goes. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, he came from a bloodline that practically guaranteed disaster. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was part schemer, part survivor, an imperial widow with ambition sharper than the blades her enemies seemed to fall on. When she married Emperor Claudius and maneuvered her son into the line of succession, it wasn't so much a family reunion as it was a corporate takeover. Claudius died mysteriously not long after. Nero, at age 16, became emperor. At first, it wasn't all madness. Nero had advisors: Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, Burrus, the Praetorian commander, who helped him rule with a surprising degree of restraint. Taxes were lowered, capital punishment was limited, public games were abundant. The empire exhaled, and then the descent. Power has a way of amplifying personality, and Nero's personality was a cocktail of insecurity, performance obsession, and delusions of grandeur. He didn't want to be a ruler. He wanted to be loved, admired, applauded, preferably while standing center stage in a tunic of gold thread, reciting poetry no one dared critique. He fancied himself an artist above all else, an actor, a singer, a poet. He even entered public competitions, which he always miraculously won. Entire cities were required to host his performances. Senators sat stone-faced through hours of mandatory theatre. Applause was not optional, it was a political necessity. And while Nero performed, Rome simmered, literally. In the year 64 AD, a great fire broke out and consumed large parts of the city. Theories abound. Was it an accident, sabotage, a civic cleansing? Nero's role remains debated, but what is certain is how he responded. He built a grand new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, on land conveniently cleared by the fire. It had rotating ceilings, gardens, fountains, and a colossal statue of himself at the entrance. Subtlety was not a design feature. Public outrage followed. Nero needed a scapegoat, so he found one, an unpopular religious sect on the fringes of Roman society. They were different, stubborn, monotheistic. Ideal targets. He accused them of arson, and the city's grief turned into a witch hunt. Justice became theatre once more, and Nero took centre stage as the empire's moral compass, albeit one spinning wildly. Meanwhile, Nero's paranoia grew. Anyone suspected of dissent, whether political, personal, or imagined, could expect exile or worse. Senators, generals, even members of his own household were dispatched under vague charges of disloyalty. His inner circle shrank, not because of betrayal, but because fear hollowed out every relationship he touched. Eventually, Rome's patience wore out. Rebellions sparked in the provinces, the wars. Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled the capital, reportedly muttering that the world would lose a great artist. His final act was, in his mind, a tragedy. For the rest of the empire, it was a curtain call on a reign where delusion had replaced governance. Yet Nero's name survived, not as a leader, not as a general, but as a metaphor, a byword for reckless vanity in the face of responsibility, for ego so inflated it crushed everything beneath it. He didn't just burn bridges, he turned them into stage props. And still, Nero was hardly the last ruler to wear a pleasant mask over a brutal regime. Because while Rome's fires eventually died out, another empire in the east was quietly building one of the most disturbing wartime legacies of the modern era. A legacy cloaked in silence and denials. Next, we step into the shadows of Imperial Japan and examine the quiet, complicated figure of Emperor Hirohito. 4. Emperor Hirohito of Japan. In photographs, he always looked so still. The glasses, the slender frame, the posture of a man who could vanish into a crowd if he weren't dressed like a living god. Emperor Hirohito ruled Japan for over 6 decades, but much of his legacy lives in what he did not say, what he did not stop, and what he did not acknowledge. Born in 1901 and enthroned in 1926, Hirohito inherited more than a crown. He inherited a mythology. According to state doctrine, he wasn't merely the emperor. He was a divine descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The throne wasn't just political, it was celestial, and that divine status made him untouchable, unquestionable, and perhaps most dangerously unaccountable. Early in his reign, Japan was already tilting toward militarism. Economic strife, resource scarcity, and a deep-seated desire for recognition on the world stage pushed the nation into an aggressive stance. But Hirohito wasn't just a bystander. He attended military briefings, signed off on campaigns, and offered imperial sanction to expansionist policies that would set East Asia ablaze. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, it wasn't a rogue military adventure. It was a calculated move, conducted with his silent approval. By the time World War II erupted, Hirohito's empire had become a war machine fueled by nationalism and wrapped in the cloth of emperor worship. Soldiers fought not just for land but for him. School children bowed to his portrait. Dissent was unthinkable. And through it all, Hirohito maintained a deliberate, cultivated image of distant detachment, close enough to inspire loyalty, far enough to dodge responsibility. There's an enduring debate among historians. Was Hirohito a puppet or a puppeteer? His defenders argue he had no real power, that the military dictated policy, and that he was trapped by tradition. But this version of events tends to overlook the fact that Hirohito was the one figure who could have, at any point, intervened, redirected, or at the very least protested. He never did. His silence wasn't passive, it was political. By the war's end, after bombed cities, massive civilian casualties, and national collapse, Hirohito made one unprecedented move. He spoke. On August 15, 1945, his voice crackled over the radio, addressing the Japanese people for the first time in history. He called for surrender, not defeat, not remorse, just surrender. His words were careful, vague, and composed in the same ceremonial tone he had always used. No mention of accountability, no apology, just a graceful descent into peace, like a god choosing to step off the battlefield. What happened next was perhaps even stranger. The Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, chose to preserve Hirohito's position. The rationale was strategic. Removing him might destabilize Japan, so they let him stay. He renounced his divine status, not out of spiritual awakening, but because it was politically expedient. He continued to reign as a constitutional monarch until his death in 1989, gradually recast as a symbol of unity rather than a symbol of power. And so, Hirohito became one of history's most successful vanishings. A man at the center of catastrophe, remembered more for his quiet than his commands. His reign was one of moral evasions and diplomatic shadows, where truth was managed like ceremony, carefully choreographed and deeply incomplete. But where Hirohito ruled through silence, the next monarch spoke with action and often blood. Her isolationist policies, her purges, and her iron-fisted rule over Madagascar would earn her a name whispered with dread and awe, because next we step into the ruthless world of Queen Ranavalona Wars. 5. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. She ruled from a stone palace perched above Antananarivo, looking down not just on her capital, but on history itself. Queen Ranavalona I, sovereign of Madagascar from 1828 to 1861, wasn't just a monarch. She was a firewall, a storm, a force of nature wrapped in royal silk, and to some, she was the incarnation of national sovereignty. To others, she was a decades-long nightmare in a crown. When Ranavalona ascended the throne, the island was already at a crossroads. European missionaries were arriving. Foreign advisors whispered in court halls, treaties were signed. The future seemed pointed toward westernization, toward industry, commerce, Christianity. Ranavalona took one look at that future and set it on fire. Her reign became a relentless campaign against foreign influence and against anything, faiths, ideas, or people that threatened the traditional authority of the Marina monarchy. She expelled missionaries. She banned Christianity, she revoked treaties, but isolation was only the beginning. Ranavalona didn't just want Madagascar untouched, she wanted it purified. She reasserted the power of the royal cult, revived traditional rituals, and leaned heavily on Fanompoana, a system of forced service to the crown. Roads were built, palaces expanded, Army ranks swelled, but behind each construction lay a trail of suffering. Thousands died under grueling conditions, marched through jungles, pushed past their physical limits. Infrastructure was achieved, yes, but at a cost so human it eroded the kingdom's soul. Then came the purges. Ranavalona believed dissent was treason, and treason was contagious. Nobles who opposed her, removed. Commoners accused of foreign sympathies, investigated. She instituted a system of ordeal-based justice that could turn mere accusation into condemnation. The logic was circular. Loyalty was proven by survival. Survival was evidence of innocence. And anyone who didn't survive, unfit by default. The body count of her reign is hard to estimate. Some say over 100,000 people died as a result of her policies, through forced labor, famine, or the consequences of expulsion and exile. Others argue that these numbers were inflated by her foreign critics, eager to paint her as a savage queen resisting the light of civilization. And therein lies the moral knot of Ranavalona. Was she a tyrant or a defender? She preserved Malagasy independence in a century when much of Africa was being swallowed by colonial appetites. While other nations fell under the boots of European powers, Madagascar stood defiantly apart. No British protectorate, no French mandate, just a queen who said no, again and again, no matter the cost. But independence enforced by fear eventually curdles into silence. Trade collapsed, technology stagnated, diplomatic ties frayed. The kingdom she protected grew smaller in ambition and heavier in grief. When Ranavalona died in 1861, she was succeeded by a more reform-minded son. He reversed much of her policy within months, reopening Madagascar to the world she had spent 3 decades keeping out. And yet, Ranavalona left a scar that still glints with contradiction. To some, she was a nationalist before the word existed, a queen who saw colonizers coming and slammed the door shut. To others, she was simply cruel. Her rule was a paradox, sovereign strength used to isolate, to punish, to preserve a kingdom that may have needed evolution more than preservation. But if Ranavalona ruled with an iron will, the next emperor wielded power like a weaponized joke, erratic, theatrical, and utterly detached from reality. A man who made absurdity into doctrine and governance into a dare, because next we descend into the grotesque empire of Caligula. 6. Caligula, Roman Emperor. It's hard to say where the legend of Caligula ends and the truth begins. Even his name, Caligula, wasn't really his name. It was a nickname, meaning little boot, given to him as a child mascot for the Roman legions. He grew up among soldiers, adored as the emperor's nephew, walking through camps in miniature armor. The soldiers saw him as a mascot of Rome's strength. The irony? That little boy would grow into the emperor who broke Rome's spirit from the inside out. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in 12 AD, he was the son of Germanicus, a general beloved by both the army and the people. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, public grief turned to bitterness, and Caligula learned early that love and loyalty in Rome were fragile currencies. He was raised in the shadows of power, first by his mother, then by the Emperor Tiberius, a man so paranoid he made distrust a form of governance. By the time Caligula came to the throne in 37 AD, the Roman people were desperate for something different. They wanted hope, spectacle, and the return of glory. For a moment, they thought they had found it. His first months as emperor were promising. He freed prisoners, granted bonuses to soldiers, and restored the rights of those wronged by Tiberius. He gave lavish public games, bread, circuses, and smiles. Rome adored him. And then came the fever. Historians debate what it was, a physical illness, a mental collapse, or both, but something changed in him. When Caligula recovered, the man who stood up was not the man who had fallen ill. He seemed convinced that he was not merely emperor by blood, but divine by nature. The line between mortal and God blurred, and Rome, unluckily, was his stage. He declared himself a living deity, Temples were erected in his honor. Statues of gods were remade with his own face. Senators were ordered to perform rituals to him. He began to refer to himself in the company of Jupiter, demanding the same reverence once reserved for celestial beings. And when reverence was offered without enthusiasm, he took it as treason. The Senate grew terrified, but Caligula seemed to thrive on fear. His rule became performance art, a kind of imperial absurdism. He spent fortunes on vanity projects, hosted endless spectacles, and indulged in symbolic humiliations of the Roman elite. He was said to have appointed his horse Incitatus as a priest, perhaps as satire, perhaps as mockery, perhaps as both. He didn't need to destroy the Senate. He could simply turn it into a joke, but even his jokes had consequences. The empire groaned under the weight of his spending. Taxes soared, treasuries emptied, provinces starved while the emperor paraded himself through palaces of marble and mirrors. Those who questioned his judgment didn't live long enough to regret it. He ruled not by law, but by impulse, a government of whims. And yet beneath the chaos lay a strange kind of logic. Fear and fascination were forms of power. Caligula understood that in Rome, spectacle was stronger than justice. If he couldn't be loved or respected, he would be remembered. When his own guards finally turned on him in 41 AD, ending his 4-year reign in the most Roman way possible through conspiracy, it wasn't the end of his myth, it was the beginning of it. Caligula left behind not a legacy of conquest, but a cautionary tale. What happens when divine ego replaces human empathy? Rome had seen tyrants before, but none who seemed to enjoy it quite so much. And just as Rome began to recover from the madness of one self-proclaimed god, another ruler, centuries earlier, was building his own legend on fear and prophecy. A king whose paranoia was so intense that it rewrote history itself. Next, the crown passes to King Herod the Great. 7. King Herod the Great. In the grand halls of biblical history, Herod the Great appears like a shadow stitched to a crown, a ruler both magnificent and monstrous, celebrated for his ambition and reviled for his fear. To some, he was the architect of Judea's golden age. To others, he was the tyrant whose throne was built on suspicion and silence. Herod's story isn't just one of cruelty, it's one of contradictions. He was born in 73 BCE, not quite royal, but close enough to reach for it. The Herodian dynasty was a patchwork of power, part Jewish, part Arab, and entirely Roman in allegiance. Herod understood early that survival in the eastern provinces meant playing politics like a street game, fast, ruthless, and without apology. He came to power with Roman support, appointed by the Senate as King of the Jews. The title was as loaded as a drawn bow. Judea was no easy province. It was torn between factions, faiths, and foreign overlords. Herod positioned himself in the middle, a Jew who built Roman temples, a king who spoke Greek in court, a client ruler who dressed his tyranny in diplomacy. To secure power, he first had to neutralize every threat, real, imagined, or manufactured, and he did so with clinical precision. The Hasmonean dynasty, from which his wife Mariam descended, was once beloved by the Jewish people. That made it a liability. Herod married into it for legitimacy, then spent the rest of his reign tearing it apart. He ordered the execution of his wife, then her mother, then her brother, then eventually 2 of his own sons. Every branch of the family tree that cast a shadow over his throne was pruned with surgical paranoia. He once famously said it was safer to be his pig than his son, a dark joke made all the darker by the fact that it was probably true. And yet, while Herod erased bloodlines, he erected monuments. He rebuilt the Second Temple in Jerusalem into a marvel of engineering and grandeur. He fortified cities, constructed palaces, and created aqueducts, theatres, and stadiums that drew admiration from across the empire. Caesarea Maritima, his showcase port city, was a technological feat that proved Judea could stand shoulder to shoulder with Rome. He was not a mindless despot. He was a builder, a strategist, a master manipulator of image. He threw games and feasts. He paid tributes. He played the part of Rome's loyal ally so well that Augustus himself called him a friend of Caesar. But behind the polished marble was a king trapped by the echo of his own doubts. Even the Gospels immortalized his paranoia. Though historians debate the event's historicity, Herod is remembered in the Christian tradition for ordering the massacre of infants in Bethlehem in a desperate attempt to eliminate a newborn king of the Jews. Whether that event occurred or not, the fact that it was believable says more about Herod than any statue he built. When Herod died in 4 BCE, he left behind a divided kingdom, split among sons who had learned more about fear than leadership. His funeral procession was grand as he had ordered. Thousands marched, musicians played, statues of him were paraded through the streets, but no monument could wash away the unease of his reign. Herod's legacy is one of dazzling surfaces and dark corridors, a ruler who expanded his kingdom and shrunk his soul. A king who gave Rome reason to praise him and his people reason to hide. 8. King Richard III of England. He is perhaps the most famous villain in English history, a crooked shadow with a crooked spine, remembered for a crown stolen and nephews vanished. King Richard III has been called a tyrant, a usurper, and a murderer, and depending on who you ask, he may have been all of those things, or none of them. But one truth remains. His rise to power was soaked in suspicion, and his reign, though brief, left a legacy of distrust that still echoes through the royal halls of England. Born in 1452 into the powerful House of York, Richard was the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York. He came of age during the bloody and complicated Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that turned England's noble families into shifting battle lines. Brothers turned on brothers, crowns were won and lost, and the idea of royal legitimacy began to seem like a very expensive joke. Richard fought loyally for his brother Edward IV, helping him reclaim and maintain the throne. He was made Duke of Gloucester, and unlike many in his family, he showed military skill, administrative competence, and a dangerous amount of patience. While others grabbed for titles, Richard waited and watched. Then came 1483. Edward IV died unexpectedly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. Richard, the boy's uncle, was named Lord Protector, a temporary role, supposedly. A guardian of the crown, not its wearer. But within weeks, the young king and his younger brother were taken to the Tower of London for their protection. They were never seen again. What happened in that tower remains one of the darkest questions in English history. The official story, at least Richard's version, was that the two boys were illegitimate, born from an unlawful marriage and therefore unfit to rule. Parliament agreed, declared Richard the rightful king, and he was crowned as Richard III. But suspicions grew like ivy. The prince's disappearance cast a permanent stain on Richard's rule. Even those who once supported him began to whisper. The disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a riddle without an answer, and one the crown could never explain away. Richard ruled for just over 2 years, but in that short time he earned a reputation for cold efficiency. He enacted reforms in the legal system that actually protected the common people, protections against corruption, access to bail, and efforts to make the court system more fair. These rarely make the history books, of course, because his reputation was already lost in the fog of the Tower. His end came at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where he faced the forces of Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant. Richard fought bravely, perhaps even foolishly, charging into battle personally. He was killed on the field, becoming the last English king to die in combat. His crown, quite literally, was picked up and placed on the head of Henry VII, beginning the Tudor dynasty. For centuries, Richard's image was defined by Shakespeare's depiction, a hunched, scheming villain willing to kill anyone who stood between him and power. A horse, my kingdom for a horse," cried the tragic tyrant as he fell. But modern historians have offered a more complicated view. Some see him as a man vilified by his enemies, others as a pragmatic power player, who made terrible choices under impossible pressures. Still, the mystery of the princes in the tower remains unsolved. Bones were discovered, theories multiplied, but certainty never came, and in that absence, Richard's ghost has never quite left the tower. Yet for all his alleged sins, Richard's cruelty was at least dressed in ambition. The next emperor ruled with far less pretense, turning vast regions into labor camps and entire philosophies into threats. Because next, we cross from medieval scandal into ancient tyranny, where books burned and scholars vanished under the rule of Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. 9. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. Some rulers build empires, others build legends. Qin Shi Huang did both and then tried to make sure no one remembered a time before him. His reign didn't just unify China geographically, it attempted to unify memory, morality, language, and even death itself. He wasn't content with ruling a country, he wanted to rule history. Born in 259 BCE as Yingzheng, the future emperor grew up in the Warring States period, a time when China was less a country and more a shattered mirror of clashing kingdoms. War was constant, alliances temporary, and peace a brief illusion. Zheng became king of the Qin state at just 13 years old, and he did not wait. Through cunning diplomacy, ruthless strategy, and well-fed armies, he launched a brutal campaign of conquest that took less than a decade to complete. By 221 BCE, he had defeated all rival kingdoms and declared himself the first emperor of a unified China. Qin Shi Huang, meaning first emperor of Qin. That title was no accident. He rejected the old term king. Kings could be challenged. Emperors were eternal. He considered his reign the start of time itself, so much so that he reset the calendar, abolished hereditary fiefdoms, and wiped clean the political map. He was, in his eyes, the axis upon which civilization now spun. With unification came standardization. Qin Shi Huang established a uniform written script, weights and measures, axle lengths for carts, and even road widths. Trade became easier, travel more predictable, and beneath this wave of bureaucratic brilliance, a colder logic settled in. If everything could be standardized, so could thought. That's when the fires began. Under the guidance of his legalist advisors, particularly the infamous Li Si, the emperor began a war not just on enemies of the state, but on ideas. He viewed Confucianism, literature, and philosophy as destabilizing forces. Anything that suggested alternate models of rule, past golden ages, or moral authority beyond the emperor was deemed subversive. Books were collected and burned. Scholars who protested were silenced. Many were buried alive, ritualistically removed from history so they couldn't contaminate the future. And yet, for all his efforts to erase the past, Qin Shi Huang was haunted by the future, particularly by death. Obsessed with immortality, he commissioned alchemists to search for the elixir of life. He toured mountains and islands rumored to hold the secrets to eternal existence. He drank potions laced with mercury, believing they would preserve him. They didn't. Still, his pursuit of permanence wasn't all mythical. His most staggering legacy was subterranean, the construction of a vast mausoleum guarded by the now famous terracotta army. Thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, and chariots buried underground, all meticulously crafted to serve him in the afterlife. It wasn't enough to rule in life, he intended to command eternity. When he died, in 210 BCE, his death was kept secret for weeks to prevent unrest. His body was transported back to the capital under false pretenses, surrounded by carts of rotting fish to mask the smell. It was a final act of stage management by a regime that had always treated truth as a tool. His dynasty did not last. Within just a few years, the Qin Empire collapsed under the weight of rebellion and resentment. But the blueprint he left behind, centralized authority, standardization, surveillance, would echo for millennia. Qin Shi Huang tried to bury chaos under order, to conquer memory with mandate. He He believed that if he could silence the past, the future would speak only his name. But the soil of history never forgets. It swells, cracks, and exposes the skeletons of control. And while China struggled to hold together after his death, across the sea, another royal would rule not with structure, but with spite, a monarch so cruel and inept that his own barons forced him to sign away his power. Because next, we meet the disastrous legacy of King John of England. 10. King John of England. If medieval England had a villain in residence, it was King John. The name itself became a cautionary tale. John the Betrayer, John the Oathbreaker, John the King, who pushed his barons so far they forced him to sign a document just to remind him that power had limits. That document, the Magna Carta, is often hailed as the beginning of constitutional government. But it wasn't written out of idealism. It was written out of exasperation. John was born in 1166, the youngest son of King Henry II. He was never meant to rule. He was nicknamed Lackland because, quite literally, he had no land to inherit. But through a twist of dynastic chaos, including the death of his elder brother Richard the Lionheart and a convenient absence of stronger rivals, John clawed his way to the throne in 1199. And once he got there, he ruled like a man trying to make up for lost time. His reign was defined by failure. He lost nearly all of England's territories in France, a humiliation so profound it reshaped European borders. The French mocked him. His own nobles distrusted him. His military campaigns were expensive and largely disastrous, yet he funded them with obsessive grinding taxation. Entire regions were squeezed for coin. Landowners were fined for anything and everything: inheritance, marriage, even the right to avoid military service. To John, governance was a cash grab, and the crown, a bill he expected everyone else to pay. But taxes were just the beginning. His justice system was notoriously corrupt. Legal decisions could be bought, delayed, or simply ignored. Disputes dragged on unless money changed hands. His enemies described him as petty and vengeful, a man who held grudges the way others held titles. Then came his clash with the church. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, John tried to install his own candidate. The Pope disagreed. John refused to back down, and in response, the Pope placed England under interdict, a religious shutdown. No church services, no weddings, no burials. For 6 years, John was excommunicated, and yet, rather than yielding, he exploited the situation, seizing church property, pocketing church revenues, and treating the spiritual crisis as a political opportunity. Eventually, everything collapsed. In 1215, facing open rebellion from his barons, John was forced to negotiate. The result was the Magna Carta, a list of demands and constraints on royal power. It was less a philosophical declaration and more a royal ceasefire. But its symbolic impact grew with time. For the first time, a king of England had been told in writing that he was not above the law. Of course, John didn't honor it. He appealed to the Pope, who annulled the charter, calling it void. Civil war followed. John died the next year, some said of dysentery, others claimed stress and rage had eaten him from within. His passing brought little mourning. The crown passed to his young son, Henry III, whose regents were left to repair a country hollowed out by misrule. King John's legacy is a contradiction. He failed as a ruler, yet his failures produced one of the most influential legal documents in history. He was hated in his lifetime and mythologized in shame afterward. Even in literature, he rarely gets redemption. He is the cowardly villain in Robin Hood tales, the monarch whose name evokes mismanagement, arrogance, and the kind of royal behavior that makes rebellions not just understandable, but inevitable. But while John stumbled into infamy through greed and incompetence, the next king stepped into darkness willingly, dragging an entire court into chaos and blood. A king of 6 wives, countless executions, and one colossal break from the church. Because next, the throne passes to King Henry VIII of England. 11. King Henry VIII of England. If there's one monarch who turned personal problems into national crises. It was King Henry VIII. He wasn't just a king, he was a one-man wrecking ball, smashing through tradition, marriage vows, religious unity, and anyone who dared to stand in the way of his desires. And yet, he's remembered as much for his flamboyant court as for the quiet terror that hung in the air whenever his temper shifted. Henry came to the throne in 1509 as the charismatic golden boy of Tudor England. Young, athletic, well-educated and popular, he seemed like the Renaissance dream in royal form. He played music, spoke several languages, jousted with flair, and hosted banquets that blurred the line between celebration and statecraft. But beneath the veneer of charm was a streak of insecurity, obsession, and control that would slowly eclipse his early promise. The trouble, as it so often did in royal courts, began with succession. Henry desperately needed a male heir. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce one that lived to adulthood, and Henry grew restless. But divorce wasn't an option, not just politically, but theologically. England was a Catholic country, and the Pope had the final say in such matters. Henry asked Rome to annul the marriage. Rome declined, so Henry changed the game. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, effectively cutting England off from the authority of the Pope. It was a seismic break, cloaked in religious reformation, but driven by personal desire. He married Anne Boleyn, his second wife, without papal approval. Parliament passed the necessary laws. Bishops either complied or disappeared. The English Reformation had begun, not from a groundswell of faith, but from a monarch who didn't like being told no. From there, Henry's rule grew heavier. He dissolved the monasteries, seizing their land and wealth, effectively erasing centuries of religious tradition and filling the royal treasury in the process. He executed dissenters, both noble and common, and restructured the nobility so that loyalty to the crown mattered more than lineage. His court became a theatre of masks, where flattery was currency and missteps could lead to ruin. And then there were the marriages, 6 in total. Political alliances, personal passions, strategic moves, all ending in either death, divorce, or disappointment. Behind every wedding was a country holding its breath. Behind every queen, a shadow of impermanence. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry was physically unrecognizable from the youth who had dazzled his kingdom. Ill, isolated, and increasingly paranoid, he left behind a fractured church, an unstable line of succession, and a court drained by decades of spectacle and suspicion. His only surviving son, Edward VI, inherited the throne as a child, just one more uncertain figure in the royal game Henry had spent his life rewriting. Henry VIII's legacy is a mix of bold transformation and ruthless self-interest. He reshaped England's political and religious landscape, not out of vision, but out of willpower. He reigned like a man convinced that history would forgive everything, as long as it was interesting. But if Henry believed kings could do no wrong, the next monarch took that belief to its terrifying extreme, ruling not through policy or reform, but through whim, obsession, and the chilling belief that power itself was proof of righteousness. Because next, we cross into the unpredictable empire of Sultan Ibrahim I, the Mad of the Ottoman Empire. 12. Sultan Ibrahim IV, the Mad of the Ottoman Empire. Few rulers have worn the crown more reluctantly or more destructively than Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire. His nickname, the Mad, wasn't just a jab at his mental state. It was an attempt to explain what happens when a man raised in isolation, suspicion, and paranoia suddenly finds himself in charge of one of the most powerful empires in the world, with no preparation and no guardrails. Born in 1615, Ibrahim was never meant to rule in the usual sense. His early life was spent almost entirely confined to the kefes, a gilded prison within the Ottoman palace complex. It was there that potential heirs to the throne were kept, technically alive, politically neutralized. The logic behind the system was simple. Better to keep possible rivals secluded than to risk civil war. But the psychological toll was profound. Ibrahim spent most of his formative years in a state of uncertainty, surrounded by shadows, cut off from real human connection, and haunted by the ever-present fear of execution. When his brother, Sultan Mehmed IV, died in 1640, Ibrahim was the last male heir left standing. He was pulled from confinement and placed on the throne almost overnight. Accounts from the time describe him as reluctant, dazed, even refusing to believe his brother was truly dead, fearing it was a trap to lure him into the open. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct honed by years of isolation. Once crowned, Ibrahim became a monarch with absolute authority, but no experience and no emotional grounding. He was highly susceptible to manipulation. His mother, Kusum Sultan, effectively ruled from behind the curtain in the early years of his reign. Ministers and courtiers quickly learned that access to the Sultan's favor could be bought, especially when flattery and indulgence were involved. The empire itself, meanwhile, suffered. Corruption deepened. Appointments to high office were based less on merit and more on bribery or personal whim. Foreign policy drifted. The Ottoman treasury was strained by excessive spending, lavish gifts, and pet projects with no strategic value. Ibrahim's focus was inward, obsessed with personal pleasures, increasingly erratic in behavior, and oblivious to the growing unrest among the military and political elite. At a time when the empire needed steady hands and clear decisions, it got confusion and spectacle. His unpredictability became a liability not just to the court, but to the entire state apparatus. Tensions with the Janissaries, the empire's elite military corps, began to rise. Faith in the throne crumbled. Eventually, even his powerful mother could no longer protect him. In 1648, after 8 chaotic years, a palace coup deposed Ibrahim. He was imprisoned and not long after executed by royal decree, a rare and chilling end for an Ottoman sultan. His death marked the final act of a reign defined less by villainy and more by vacancy, mismanagement, and the dangers of inherited power without guidance. But if Ibrahim's madness was nurtured by captivity, the next emperor wielded terror by choice, constructing monuments to power while erasing entire families in the name of control. A man whose name meant perpetual happiness, though his reign was anything but. Because next, we enter the ruthless court of Emperor Yongle of China. 13. Emperor Yongle of China. His reign was supposed to bring joy, at least if you believed the name. Yongle means perpetual happiness, but the man who bore the title left a legacy written in power, paranoia, and purges. Emperor Yongle, born Zhu Di in 1360, was the third emperor of China's Ming dynasty, and like many rulers in this lineup, he wasn't supposed to wear the crown. He took it anyway, and made sure no one would forget how. Zhu Di was the fourth son of the Ming dynasty's founder, the Hongwu Emperor, a man so authoritarian he probably dreamed of micromanaging the weather. When Hongwu died, the throne passed not to Zhu Di, but to his grandson, the Jianwen Emperor. A teenager with idealism but little experience, Jianwen tried to consolidate power by reducing the influence of his uncles, including Zhu Di. Zhu Di's response was not subtle. In 1399, he launched what became known as the Jingnan Campaign, a 3-year civil war that culminated in his forces storming the capital and mysteriously rescuing the government from his nephew, who vanished from history under circumstances polite historians still describe as uncertain. Once Zhu Di secured the throne, he gave himself a new name, Yongle, and began reconstructing the empire not just in his image, but around his authority. His reign had grandeur. He moved the capital north from Nanjing to Beijing and began constructing the Forbidden City, a sprawling imperial complex designed to physically and symbolically place the emperor at the center of the universe. He strengthened the civil service, revived Confucian scholarship, and commissioned the Yongle Dadian, a massive encyclopedia intended to capture the entire body of Chinese knowledge. He sent out the famed Admiral Zheng He on naval expeditions that reached as far as East Africa, projecting Chinese power across the seas. But behind the curtain of cultural achievement was a climate of ruthless consolidation. Yongle's rule was marked by some of the most intense political purges in Chinese imperial history. Following his seizure of the throne, he initiated widespread investigations into anyone who had supported his predecessor. Thousands of officials were implicated, many were executed, others suffered collective punishment, entire families removed, careers ended, reputations buried. Fear became a management tool. His network of secret police operated with near-total autonomy, investigating disloyalty at every level of society. The definition of treason expanded to include whispers, sympathies, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The emperor, for all his public devotion to Confucian harmony, ruled through suspicion and silence. Even his foreign policy bore the marks of control. The naval voyages of Zheng He, often celebrated as peaceful trade missions, were also symbolic shows of force, floating declarations of Yongle's supremacy. When tribute was offered, China responded with gifts. When tribute wasn't, there were consequences. Yongle died in 1424, leaving behind a fortified capital, a deeply shaken bureaucracy, and a China that had grown both in scope and in silence. His was a reign of stunning contrast, cultural brilliance set against political brutality, forward vision fused with backward repression. And while Yongle built empires on fear and architecture, the next monarch turned sectarian tension into a massacre, erupting in bloodshed so sudden and calculated it stained not only a kingdom but the conscience of a continent. Because next we face the brutal legacy of King Charles IX of France. 14. King Charles IX of France. Some monarchs inherit crowns, others inherit fires. King Charles IX of France inherited both and then poured oil on the blaze. Crowned at just 10 years old during one of the most violent periods in French history, Charles was a boy king in a nation split down the middle. Catholic versus Huguenot, old power versus reform. The wars of religion were already rumbling beneath the surface when Charles took the throne in 1560. By the time his reign ended 14 years later, that rumbling had turned into a roar. As a child, Charles had little say in the affairs of state. Real power rested with his formidable mother, Catherine de' Medici, a shrewd political operator with the instincts of a survivor and the spine of a Roman senator. She ruled from behind the veil, managing factions, arranging marriages, and playing rival nobles against one another with exhausting precision. But balance was never her endgame. It was containment. France at the time was a powder keg. The Protestant Reformation had swept through Europe, and French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were gaining influence. The Catholic elite saw them as heretics and traitors. The Huguenots saw themselves as modernizers and victims. Neither side was entirely wrong. Both sides were entirely armed. In an effort to secure peace, Catherine arranged a politically strategic marriage between her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, and the Protestant prince Henry of Navarre. The wedding brought thousands of Protestants to Paris in 1572. For a moment, it looked like unity might be possible. Then came the night. On August the 24th, 1572, just days after the wedding, violence erupted. What began as an assassination attempt on Huguenot leader Gaspard de Coligny turned into a full-scale massacre. Over the next several days, Protestant men, women, and children were hunted through the streets of Paris and killed by Catholic mobs. The violence spread to the provinces. In total, thousands died. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, as it came to be known, would stain Charles IX's reign forever. The role Charles played in ordering or simply allowing the massacre remains debated. What is clear is that he was present at the council where the decision to act against the Huguenot leadership was made. Some say he was manipulated by his mother. Others argue he gave the order himself, either out of fear, fury, or sheer exhaustion from trying to hold together a kingdom tearing at the seams. After the massacre, Charles reportedly spiraled. His health declined. He became erratic, plagued by guilt and paranoia. He died just 2 years later at the age of 23. Some said it was illness. Others whispered it was the weight of what he'd allowed. Charles IX never fully ruled, never fully resisted, and never fully recovered. His legacy is a cautionary tale of weak kings in strong storms, and how inaction, when mixed with fear, can be just as destructive as tyranny. But while Charles ruled in indecision, the next emperor ruled with cold, calculated intent. He didn't simply punish disloyalty, he institutionalized it, turned it into policy, and called it order. Because next we move from the shattered altars of France to the marble corridors of Rome under Emperor Tiberius. 15. Emperor Tiberius of Rome. Tiberius was never supposed to be emperor. He didn't want the power, didn't chase the crown, and didn't enjoy the spotlight. And maybe that's what made him dangerous. He didn't rule Rome like a conqueror or a visionary. He ruled it like a man reluctantly trapped in a cage made of expectations, suspicion, and power he couldn't escape. Born in 42 BCE, Tiberius was the stepson of Rome's first emperor Augustus, who spent much of his life grooming successors and then discarding them when they failed to meet his exacting standards. Tiberius was an afterthought for years, overshadowed by more charismatic heirs who died or disappointed one by one until only Tiberius remained. In 14 CE, when Augustus finally died, Rome had its second emperor, and the empire, which had been learning how to be ruled by one man, now had to learn what it meant to be ruled by one man who didn't care to be loved. In his early years, Tiberius governed with caution and competence. He kept the empire's borders secure, balanced the budget, and avoided unnecessary wars. He understood administration, preferred routine over glory, and had little appetite for extravagance. But as the years wore on, the emperor's distrust grew deeper and more dangerous. Tiberius believed Rome's Senate was filled with flatterers and traitors, and unfortunately for Rome, he wasn't entirely wrong. The Senate, weakened under Augustus, had lost much of its independence and authority. What remained was a body skilled in self-preservation, eager to praise, reluctant to oppose. But where Augustus had played the game with charm and manipulation, Tiberius played it with bitterness and withdrawal. He began retreating from public life. By 26 CE, he left Rome entirely, relocating to the island of Capri, a secluded cliff-top retreat where he could watch the empire from a distance. He rarely returned. Official business was conducted through letters. Meanwhile, his growing distrust of the Senate and of people in general manifested in a rise of treason trials. Accusations of disloyalty became political tools. A word, a joke, an insult whispered at the wrong banquet could lead to charges of treason. Confiscated property flowed into imperial coffers. Senators and equestrians lived in fear. The city of Rome held its breath. At the center of this machinery was Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard and Tiberius's right hand. For years, Sejanus acted as the emperor's proxy in Rome, consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and perhaps nursing ambitions of his own. Eventually, Tiberius turned on him too. Sejanus was arrested, executed, and his name struck from records. More purges followed. Tiberius had come to see conspiracy everywhere, and in the absence of real enemies, suspicion filled the gaps. He died in 37 CE, an old man cut off from his capital, his people, and any legacy of affection. Rome had survived him, but it had been bruised in the process, made colder, more cynical, and more used to living under the shadow of absolute rule. But where Tiberius's paranoia hollowed out the empire from within, the next Tsar ruled as if repression itself were a patriotic duty. A sovereign who believed surveillance was safety, and whose grip on Russia came at the cost of its soul. Because next we descend into the iron-fisted reign of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. 16. Tsar Nicholas IV of Russia. If absolutism had a patron saint, it would be Tsar Nicholas I. His reign, beginning in 1825, was not merely about ruling. It was about control, doctrine and order, imposed from the top down like a steel lid on a boiling pot. For Nicholas, Russia was not a nation to be led, but a fortress to be defended. From enemies abroad, ideas within, and most of all, from change. He wasn't born to be Tsar. That role was meant for his older brother, Alexander I, whose death sparked confusion and chaos. A brief succession crisis erupted, giving birth to the Decembrist Revolt, a failed uprising led by liberal-minded army officers demanding a constitutional monarchy. The rebellion was swiftly crushed. Nicholas witnessed it all from the throne he had barely ascended. The lesson he took from the event was simple and lifelong. Reform equals instability. From that moment on, Nicholas ruled like a man determined never to be surprised again. He saw Russia as a holy empire, ordained by God and protected by discipline. His ideological slogan, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, was both a guiding principle and a warning. Religion had to support the state, authority had to flow from the Tsar, and any cultural or political identity that didn't fit neatly into imperial unity was viewed as a threat. His bureaucracy expanded rapidly, not to empower the people, but to watch them. The third section, his secret police, became the eyes and ears of the empire, monitoring dissent, censoring publications, and infiltrating intellectual circles. Students, writers, philosophers, none were spared. Suspicion became the default posture of the state. Under Nicholas, Russia became a nation allergic to innovation. While industrial revolutions swept across Europe, Russia lagged behind, tied down by a feudal system of serfdom that remained untouched. Nicholas saw industrial capitalism and liberal democracy not as progress, but as chaos wearing a powdered wig. So he resisted forcefully. Universities were restricted, Western books were banned, foreign influences were filtered through censors who believed knowledge should be both patriotic and polite. And yet, for all this domestic ironclad order, Nicholas projected strength abroad. He cast himself as Europe's policeman, intervening in revolutions and lending troops to crush liberal uprisings in neighboring countries. At home, he built railroads and expanded the military. He was admired for his discipline, provided you weren't one of the people being disciplined. But repression has limits. His conservative grip created an empire that looked stable from the outside, yet seethed underneath. By the time he died in 1855, Russia was locked in the Crimean War, outmatched by more modern European powers. His carefully ordered empire had become brittle, its inefficiencies laid bare on the battlefield. Nicholas I ruled not with vision, but with vigilance. His legacy was not a thriving Russia, but a frightened one, strangled by surveillance, cemented in suspicion, and left teetering on the edge of the 20th century with 18th century tools. But if Nicholas feared rebellion, the next royal created an institution designed to enforce it, one that turned torture into orthodoxy and dogma into law. Because next, we enter the flame-lit chambers of the Spanish Inquisition and the iron will of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Spain. 17. King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. They're often remembered with grandeur. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain, sponsored Columbus, and laid the foundation for a global empire. But beneath the romantic portraits and textbook praise lies a reign defined not just by religious devotion, but by a calculated, systematic policy of repression, exclusion, and control. Their rule didn't just unify Spain, it purified it. At least that was the plan. When Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, their union didn't immediately create a unified Spain, but it laid the political groundwork for one. Their marriage brought together two powerful kingdoms, pooling resources, military strength, and influence. Together, they pursued a vision of a singular, consolidated Spanish identity: one crown, one faith, one nation. And for them, anything that stood in the way of that vision was treated as a threat. This vision crystallized most notoriously in 1478, when the monarchs secured papal approval to establish a new institution, the Spanish Inquisition. Unlike earlier versions of inquisitorial bodies in Europe, this one answered directly to the crown, not the Pope. It wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was about policing identity. At first, its primary targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, but were suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. These new Christians had achieved economic success and social prominence in many regions, which only fueled resentment among the old aristocracy. The Inquisition's role was to examine the sincerity of these conversions, but in practice it became a tool of fear. Public accusations, secret trials, and forced confessions created an atmosphere where innocence became irrelevant. Suspicion alone was enough. Eventually, in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all unconverted Jews from Spain. The decree gave them 4 months to leave or convert. Many fled, leaving behind property, businesses, and generations of cultural heritage. Those who stayed often faced continued surveillance under the Inquisition. A few years later, Muslims too would face similar choices: conversion, exile, or eventual repression. Their policies weren't just spiritual, they were also strategic. In a time of political instability and religious pluralism, Ferdinand and Isabella believed religious unity would produce political loyalty. But instead of unity, they created a legacy of fear and division. Spain's cultural diversity, once its strength under earlier Muslim rule, was hollowed out. Intellectual vibrancy dimmed. A country that had once hosted scholars, poets, and philosophers of 3 great Abrahamic faiths became a nation defined by exclusion. Even their famed sponsorship of Columbus wasn't a triumph of vision, but a gamble driven by the same ambition: expansion of Catholic dominion. As their armies completed the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, their fleet was preparing to sail westward in search of trade routes, converts, and empire. The world they sought to explore was one they already aimed to control, spiritually and politically. Ferdinand and Isabella left behind more than a dynasty. They left behind an idea that monarchy and religion should move in lockstep, and that faith, enforced by fear, could build a stronger state. It did for a while, but it also seeded centuries of suspicion, exile, and repression that Spain would struggle to reconcile. And while the Catholic monarchs institutionalized belief as law, the next emperor would take a far more direct approach to dissent, choosing the sword over the sermon and leaving 30,000 bodies beneath the rubble of a single rebellion. Because next, we turn to the chilling aftermath of the Nika riots and the iron hand of Emperor Justinian I of Byzantium. 18. Emperor Justinian I of Byzantium. To some, he was Justinian the Great, the lawgiver, the builder of empires, the architect of the Hagia Sophia, and the man who dreamed of Rome restored. But greatness, especially in imperial terms, often comes packaged with cruelty, and Justinian's legacy, shining as it might appear from a distance, casts a long and merciless shadow. Born a peasant in 482 CE, Justinian clawed his way into power not through birthright but ambition. His uncle, Justin I, rose through the military ranks to become emperor and adopted Justinian as his heir. When Justinian took the throne in 527, he had big plans. He wanted to reunite the Eastern and Western Roman empires, codify Roman law, and make Constantinople the jewel of Christendom. and to a remarkable extent he succeeded, but he also ruled like a man who believed progress required force, and when challenged he struck back with absolute finality. Nowhere is this more evident than in the infamous Nika riots of 532 CE. It began, as many great disasters do, with something deceptively trivial: chariot racing. In Constantinople, the Hippodrome wasn't just a sports arena, it was a political battlefield. The city's two major racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, weren't mere fans. They were quasi-political groups with deep social influence. At times they aligned with religious factions or even expressed dissent against imperial policies. Justinian tried to play both sides, but tensions mounted. Then came a botched execution of two faction members, one from each side. The crowd revolted. What followed wasn't a protest, it was an uprising. The rioters burned parts of Constantinople, including the original Hagia Sophia. They looted the city. For 5 days chaos reigned. Senators turned against the emperor. There was talk of replacing him, and for a moment Justinian wavered. He considered fleeing, but Theodora, his powerful and sharp-minded empress, reportedly reminded him that purple makes a fine burial shroud. Inspired or cornered, Justinian chose survival through suppression. He summoned his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, and launched a brutal counter-offensive. Under the pretense of negotiation, thousands of rioters were lured into the Hippodrome. Once inside, the gates were sealed. Soldiers entered. What happened next was less a battle than a trap. The number of dead is estimated at over 30,000, a staggering loss of life in a single day, all in the heart of the empire's capital. Justinian didn't flinch. The city was rebuilt. The Hagia Sophia rose from the ashes, grander and more majestic than before. His legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became a foundational pillar of European law. His conquests reclaimed parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain. On paper, his reign gleamed, but all of it, the glory, the buildings, the laws, was held together by a ruthless certainty. The dissent was disorder, and order must be absolute. He ruled through awe and fear, wrapped in divine mandate and imperial efficiency. The emperor as redeemer and enforcer. Justinian died in 565 CE, having reshaped the Byzantine Empire into a vision of order and splendor. But the cost was silence, enforced, unyielding silence. And while Justinian crushed mobs in a single decisive stroke, the next king deployed cruelty not as a response, but as policy, draping himself in divine right, while his judges earned names like the Hanging Judge. Because next, the crown darkens again under King James II of England. 19. King James II of England. James II ruled like a man determined to find the exact breaking point of a nation's patience. He didn't stumble into crisis, nor did he quietly inherit one. Instead, he walked straight into the middle of a cultural and political minefield, then started lighting matches. Born in 1633, James was the younger brother of Charles II and the second son of the executed Charles of Thurs, whose beheading during the English Civil War had been a hard-won lesson in the limits of monarchy. That lesson, it seems, James chose to ignore. Where Charles II had ruled with caution and compromise, mellowed by exile and keen on self-preservation, James came to the throne in 1685 with a much firmer conviction that kings ruled by divine right, and Parliament was a formality he could afford to sideline. From the start, his reign provoked anxiety. James was openly Catholic in a fiercely Protestant country that had spent the better part of a century trying to distance itself from Rome. His subjects could tolerate Catholic sympathies from a distance. His brother had managed to keep peace by pretending not to care too much. But James didn't pretend. He pushed for religious tolerance in a way that felt to his Protestant subjects like favoritism wrapped in royal authority. Still, religious preference alone might not have doomed him. The real damage came from his aggressive use of the courts and the military to enforce his will. James suspended laws, appointed Catholics to powerful positions in direct defiance of Parliament, and ignored legislative consent with a brazenness that sent chills through even his allies. But the flashpoint came during the Monmouth Rebellion. In 1685, James Scott, the Protestant Duke of Monmouth and an illegitimate son of Charles II, led a rebellion to depose James II. The uprising failed. What followed didn't just restore order, it redefined cruelty in the English legal system. In the wake of the rebellion, James unleashed a wave of judicial reprisals known as the Bloody Assizes, presided over by Judge George Jeffreys, a man whose name would become synonymous with merciless justice. Thousands of suspected rebels were tried in quick succession. The trials were rushed, the sentences harsh, and the punishment severe. Though James didn't personally conduct the trials, they were carried out under his authority and with his full approval. To many, it was a massacre wrapped in the language of legality. Even staunch royalists began to question whether James was safeguarding the crown or simply settling scores. The final blow came in 1688, when James's wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir. Until then, many in England had tolerated James's rule under the assumption that his Protestant daughters would succeed him. But the prospect of a Catholic dynasty was too much. Protestant nobles invited William of Orange, James's son-in-law, to invade. When William landed in England with barely a fight, James fled. Parliament called it an abdication. James II spent the rest of his life in exile, still insisting he was king, while England quietly rewrote its constitution to ensure no monarch would ever again rule with unchecked authority. But if James wielded the courts as weapons, the next emperor enforced power with full military theatrics, crowning himself in a foreign land, imposing harsh laws, and overseeing mass executions in a country he barely understood. Because next, we descend into the troubled, short-lived empire of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. 20. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Maximilian? I ruled Mexico like a man performing a role in a play no one wanted to watch. An Austrian archduke turned accidental emperor, his reign was a strange and tragic blend of misplaced idealism, foreign intervention, and catastrophic misreading of the room. From the moment his boots touched Mexican soil, Maximilian was a monarch out of context, dressed for a ball, wandering through a battlefield. Born in 1832 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Maximilian was the younger brother of Franz Joseph I of Austria. While his brother navigated the brutal pragmatism of European politics, Maximilian preferred the softer arts of architecture, botany, and liberal philosophy. He was charming, thoughtful, and deeply romantic, not traits that would serve him well once Napoleon III of France came knocking with a crown and a plan. In the early 1860s, France, along with Spain and Britain, had sent forces to Mexico, demanding repayment of debts. While Britain and Spain quickly withdrew, France, under Napoleon III, had grander ambitions. He envisioned a pro-French Catholic empire in the Americas, ideally one that could serve as a buffer against US expansionism. All he needed was a pliable European noble to sit on the throne. Enter Maximilian. Lured by flattery, idealism, and perhaps a desire to escape his more disciplined brother's shadow, Maximilian accepted the offer in 1864. The French army installed him as Emperor of Mexico, claiming he had been invited by the Mexican people. In reality, support came from a small conservative faction, while the majority of Mexicans, including the legitimate Republican president Benito Juarez, viewed Maximilian as a foreign puppet. He tried to prove them wrong. To his credit, Maximilian implemented progressive reforms. He supported land redistribution, built infrastructure, protected indigenous communities, and refused to return confiscated properties to the wealthy elites who had backed his rise. In short, he governed like a liberal monarch in a conservative costume, and alienated almost everyone. The French soon realized they had backed the wrong man. As US pressure mounted following the Civil War, Napoleon III withdrew French support. Maximilian, urged to abdicate, refused. Whether out of honor, denial, or sheer hubris, he remained in Mexico, issuing decrees, believing legitimacy could be forged through policy rather than politics. In 1867, Republican forces captured him in Querétaro. His capture marked the end of one of the most ill-fated imperial experiments in modern history. Despite international pleas for clemency, including from Victor Hugo and other prominent Europeans, Maximilian was sentenced to death. He reportedly faced his execution with composure, asking to die with dignity. His reign lasted only 3 years, but its consequences rippled far beyond the imperial court. Maximilian's story is a reminder of what happens when monarchy is imposed from above, when foreign ambition overrides national will, and when idealism meets the hard surface of reality. He came to Mexico bearing visions of empire, justice, and unity. He left it with none, a stranger in life, a footnote in death, and a symbol of how power without place is just theatre in the wrong language. And while Maximilian's tragedy was one of misplacement, the next ruler embraced power with grim clarity, ruling with violence, vanity, and accusations so extreme they defied belief. Because next we descend into the brutal regime of Emperor Bokassa IV of the Central African Empire. 21. Emperor Bokassa of the Central African Empire. There are monarchs who seize power, there are those who inherit it. And then there's Jean Bedel Bokassa, a man who simply declared it, crowning himself Emperor of the Central African Empire in a display so opulent, so absurd, and so violently out of touch with reality that it could have passed for satire, if not for the suffering it masked. Bokassa's rise was not born from noble lineage or dynastic inheritance. He began as a military officer in the newly independent Central African Republic, a French-trained soldier with political ambition and a gift for self-promotion. In 1966, he staged a coup against his cousin, President David Dacko, and installed himself as head of state. What followed was a slow, calculated transformation from president to ruler for life to self-declared emperor, all wrapped in the theatrical robes of absolute power. By 1976, Bokassa announced the creation of the Central African Empire, modelled explicitly after Napoleon Bonaparte's. He wasn't subtle, he dressed the part, literally. His coronation in 1977 cost an estimated $20 million, nearly a third of the country's annual budget. Imported French champagne flowed, his robe was lined with ermine and sequins. A golden throne shaped like an eagle was commissioned, and a diamond-studded crown was placed on his head by himself. Not even a foreign dignitary did him the honors. It was a spectacle of imperial fantasy in a nation where schools lacked chalk and hospitals lacked electricity. But beneath the velvet and trumpets, Bokassa ruled with fear. He centralized power, dissolved political opposition, and filled prisons with anyone who criticized his regime: journalists, students, teachers, and officials. Accusations of brutality and repression swirled throughout his reign, drawing increasing concern from the international community. Despite his violent reputation, Bokassa maintained a complicated relationship with France, the former colonial power. At first, they supported him. He was, after all, anti-communist and willing to play ball with French business interests. But eventually, the absurdity and the allegations became too much. His lavish lifestyle, cult of personality, and brutal tactics embarrassed his European allies. When rumors of atrocities reached a tipping point, France finally withdrew its support. In 1979, while Bokassa was abroad, France launched Operation Barracuda, a military intervention that quietly restored his ousted cousin to power. Bokassa returned to find himself deposed, his empire dissolved, and his throne reduced to a museum curiosity. He fled into exile, first to Côte d'Ivoire, then to France. Remarkably, he returned to the Central African Republic in 1986, where he was promptly arrested and tried for various crimes. He was convicted but spared execution and later released in a wave of national reconciliation. He died in 1996, still calling himself Emperor. Bokassa's empire was short-lived, but it left a long scar. He turned a struggling republic into a royal stage play, funded by foreign aid and enforced by fear. His legacy is not one of nation-building, but of grandeur detached from reality, proof that vanity, when weaponized, can devour an entire country's future. And while Bokassa ruled in eccentric spectacle, the next sultan ruled through grim suppression, wielding power with religious justification and a readiness to extinguish dissent at scale. Because next, the bloodline turns towards Sultan Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire. 22. Sultan Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed IV was born into a throne built on contradiction. He ruled an empire that stretched from Hungary to Mecca, governed by a palace system more intricate than a chessboard, yet held together with brutal simplicity: obey or be removed. His reign lasted nearly 4 decades, an eternity by Ottoman standards, but it is remembered not for peace or stability, but for blood-soaked purges, palace coups, and religious violence disguised as virtue. Born in 1642, Mehmed became sultan at just 6 years old, following the deposition of his mentally unstable father, Sultan Ibrahim I, whose chaotic rule had left the empire exhausted and on the edge of collapse. The boy sultan's rise marked the beginning of a period often referred to as the Köprülü era, named for the Grand Viziers who actually ran the empire while Mehmed matured behind the curtains of Topkapi Palace. These viziers, especially the formidable Köprülü Mehmed Pasha and his son Fazıl Ahmed, used their near-dictatorial powers to restore order, enforce obedience, and launch aggressive military campaigns. To the Ottomans, Mehmed IV was nicknamed Avci, the hunter, due to his passion for the sport, which became something of an obsession. He spent more time tracking deer and boar than presiding over court sessions. But while the Sultan was physically absent from many matters of governance, his name was never far from the consequences. Policies passed under his reign carried the weight of his authority, and his court became a revolving door of loyalty tests and ideological enforcement. Religious conformity was demanded, particularly within the empire's Muslim population. Under the influence of conservative religious scholars and military officials, Mehmed's regime cracked down on heterodox sects, mystics, and even mainstream scholars who were viewed as politically unreliable. Entire communities were suppressed. In cities like Aleppo and Baghdad, uprisings and unrest were met not with negotiation, but with harsh reprisals. Beyond religious tensions, Mehmed's reign was marked by the empire's increasing instability. Despite early military successes in Hungary and Crete, the Ottoman campaign into Vienna in 1683 would prove catastrophic. The failed siege triggered a wave of defeats that sent the empire into military retreat, exposing the limits of its power and the consequences of overreach. Internally, this military disaster shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility and emboldened factions within the empire. In 1687, after decades of rule, Mehmed IV was overthrown in a palace coup led by the Janissaries, an elite military corps that had once served as the Sultan's fiercest protectors, but had become increasingly unruly and politicized. He was deposed and replaced by his brother, Suleiman II. Mehmed lived in quiet exile until his death in 1693, largely forgotten by the empire he once ruled. Mehmed IV's legacy is one of paradox. His rule saw attempts at centralization, but bred fragmentation. He was a figurehead monarch who outlived most of his more competent viziers. And while he claimed to restore Islamic order, he left behind a state cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. But if Mehmed's empire faltered in its twilight, the next monarch wielded his own religious orthodoxy like a blade, defining rule through conquest, suppression, and a zeal that turned a subcontinent into a battlefield of belief. Because next, we confront the dogged absolutism of King Philip II of Spain. 23. King Philip II of Spain. If King Philip II had a motto, it might have been God first, Empire second, mercy nowhere on the list. He wasn't flamboyant like his rivals, nor theatrical like his enemies. He didn't posture in gold or hold court for adoring crowds. He sat for hours alone in the palace he built, the Escorial, surrounded by silence, paper, and a sense of divine duty that made compromise feel like betrayal. He saw himself not merely as a king, but as the executor of God's will on earth, and he ruled accordingly. Born in 1527, Philip was the son of Emperor Charles V and inherited a globe-spanning empire. Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, colonies in the Americas, and influence stretching from Manila to Mexico City. But with that empire came fires, many of them started by Philip himself. While other monarchs sought to manage division, Philip tried to extinguish it. Dissent wasn't something to be debated, it was something to be corrected, quickly, permanently, and without apology. At the heart of his reign was an unwavering devotion to Catholic orthodoxy. Philip viewed the Protestant Reformation not as a theological disagreement, but as a personal affront to the divine order. In response, he became one of the fiercest enforcers of the Inquisition, a system of religious courts and interrogations meant to root out heresy. It had existed before him, yes, but under Philip, it became a machine of enforcement. Books were banned, suspects were interrogated. Faith was not a private matter, it was an affair of state. Nowhere did his absolutism strike harder than in the Netherlands, a region under Spanish rule that leaned increasingly Protestant and resented being ruled from afar by a king they rarely saw. What began as a political grievance turned into open revolt. Philip's response was swift and brutal. He sent the Duke of Alba, one of his most feared generals, to crush the rebellion. Alba arrived with a tribunal so merciless it was nicknamed the Council of Blood. Executions, imprisonments, and confiscations followed. The violence didn't pacify the region, it radicalized it. The Dutch revolt grew, eventually turning into an 80-year war that fractured the Spanish Empire and birthed an independent Dutch republic. Philip also turned his gaze toward England. Incensed by Queen Elizabeth I's Protestantism and her harboring of Catholic rebels, he launched the Spanish Armada in 1588, a grand fleet meant to invade, convert, and replace. It failed spectacularly. Storms and miscalculations scattered the fleet. Ships were lost, sailors drowned, and Philip, who had believed God was on his side, was forced to admit that divine favor does not guarantee naval precision. Yet through it all, Philip believed he was right. That truth was fixed, that authority was sacred, and that kingship was not a job, but a burden of moral rectitude. He ruled not to please, but to purify. Philip died in 1598, exhausted, unbending, and convinced of his righteousness. His empire, while still vast, had begun to fray. His wars drained Spain's wealth. His intolerance hollowed out its intellectual and cultural resilience. And his legacy? A cautionary tale of religious zeal fused with absolute monarchy. But where Philip smothered dissent with institutional force, the next emperor did it with his bare hands, reigning not through ideology, but through chaos, cruelty, and ego gone unchecked. Because next we descend into the deranged court of Emperor Commodus of Rome. 24. Emperor Commodus of Rome. If Rome's decline had a face, it wore a crown and flexed in a mirror. Emperor Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, came to power in 180 CE with all the benefits of noble birth, a legacy of stoic wisdom, and the stability of a well-governed empire. He squandered all of it, and quickly. Where his father had ruled with discipline and philosophical restraint, Commodus treated Rome like his personal stage, throne room, and playground all at once. He wasn't a statesman, he was a spectacle. Born in 161 CE, Commodus was the first Roman emperor born in the purple, meaning he was born during his father's reign. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, likely hoped to raise a worthy heir to match the ideals laid out in his Meditations. Instead, he raised a performer, not a philosopher. Commodus showed little interest in governing and even less interest in humility. His hobbies included dressing up as Hercules, commissioning statues of himself in divine poses, and, perhaps most infamously, fighting in the gladiatorial arena. Not watching, participating. To the Roman elite, this was horrifying. The emperor, whose every word shaped laws and armies, was now charging into staged fights with wooden swords and paid opponents. The outcomes were guaranteed. The message was worse. Commodus saw no line between power and performance. He renamed months after himself, cities after himself, and even tried to rename Rome itself as Colonia Commodiana. For him, identity and empire were interchangeable, because both were his. But while he obsessed over his image, the empire's infrastructure suffered. Commodus delegated governance to a rotating cast of favorites, many of whom ruled through manipulation, blackmail, or raw incompetence. Corruption flourished. Officials bought their offices. Decisions were made on whims or bribes. The Senate was increasingly sidelined, reduced to little more than a ceremonial body that applauded on cue. Commodus didn't tolerate criticism. Those who opposed him, politicians, generals, even former allies, were exiled or executed. One of his most trusted advisors, the Praetorian prefect Perennis, was accused of treason and killed. Later, his chamberlain Cleander rose to power, only to be blamed for a grain shortage and torn apart by an angry mob. Commodus responded by retreating even further into delusion, seeing enemies in every shadow and reassurance in every mirror. Eventually, the charade collapsed. On New Year's Eve, 192 CE, a conspiracy involving his mistress, his wrestling partner, and his own staff succeeded in assassinating him. He was strangled in his bath by a professional fighter, an ironic end for a man who treated power like a match in the arena. His death ended the Nerva-Antonine dynasty and plunged Rome into civil war. Within months, several generals would claim the throne, each backed by armies more loyal to ambition than to law. Commodus left behind more than a tarnished name. He left behind a template for disaster, a ruler who believed that image was everything, that dissent was disloyalty, and that the empire was simply an audience waiting to be entertained. But where Commodus treated faith as costume and politics as theatre, the next emperor saw faith as threat and worship as treason, launching one of the harshest religious persecutions in Roman history. Because next, the empire turns toward the cold, commanding gaze of Emperor Diocletian. 25. Emperor Diocletian of Rome. By the time Diocletian came to power in 284 CE, Rome was a broken empire, pretending it was still a republic. Civil wars, economic instability, and a revolving door of emperors had left the once mighty state flailing. Diocletian didn't just want to fix it, he wanted to remake it, structure it, stabilize it, and hammer it into something unbreakable, and he very nearly succeeded. But beneath his reforms, his grand architecture of control, lay a cold philosophy: unity by elimination, order by force, loyalty by fear. Born in modest circumstances in Dalmatia, Diocletian rose through the military ranks during a time when emperors were chosen less by bloodline and more by swordsmanship. When he took power, he inherited a state that had seen more than 20 emperors in just 50 years. To say trust in leadership was low would be a dramatic understatement. Diocletian's solution: multiply the emperors, divide the power. He created the Tetrarchy, a system where the empire would be ruled by 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesares, each overseeing a specific geographic region. In theory, it would prevent civil war by eliminating succession disputes. In practice, it created four competing centers of power that could only function with strict coordination and with Diocletian's personality dominating them all. Beyond administration, Diocletian attacked the economy with the same militaristic zeal. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an ambitious but ultimately doomed attempt to curb inflation by setting price ceilings on thousands of goods and services. It was poorly enforced and widely ignored. Markets distorted, shortages worsened, but the intent was clear. Diocletian wasn't afraid to legislate reality if it meant preserving stability. And then there was religion. For much of Roman history, religion had been a loose collection of traditions and temple-based rituals. As long as citizens paid homage to Rome's pantheon and the divine status of the emperor, they could more or less worship as they pleased. But Diocletian saw this pluralism as a threat to unity, especially in the rising tide of Christianity, which refused to acknowledge any authority higher than its own god. In 303 CE, he launched what would become known as the Great Persecution, the most severe and systematic campaign against Christians in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were seized, Christians were arrested, stripped of rights, and forced to choose between their faith and their lives. While earlier emperors had targeted Christians sporadically, Diocletian made it policy, not because he feared rebellion, but because he feared ideological division. He wanted a Rome that moved in one direction, spoke with one voice, and bowed to one throne. Christianity, with its allegiance to an invisible God over a visible emperor, was intolerable to his vision of order. Diocletian voluntarily abdicated in 305 CE, and an almost unheard of act for a Roman emperor. He retired to a palace in modern-day Croatia, where he famously spent his final years tending to his gardens and refusing all calls to return to power. He had built an empire of stone and statute, of divisions and edicts, but even in retirement he watched it begin to crack. Because order, no matter how tightly enforced, has a limit. And where Diocletian punished belief to preserve the state, the next emperor would use belief as a weapon to divide it, launching cultural purges, demolishing sacred sites, and transforming India's Mughal dynasty into a battlefield of ideology. Because next we cross into the unforgiving reign of Emperor Aurangzeb of India. 26. Emperor Aurangzeb of India. In the long and ornate line of the Mughal emperors, Aurangzeb was both the most devout and the most divisive. To his supporters, he was a pious ruler who tried to purify the empire from within. To his critics, he was a king who traded the pluralistic legacy of his ancestors for a single-minded orthodoxy, turning one of the world's most cosmopolitan empires into a stage for suppression. Born in 1618, Aurangzeb was the sixth son of Shah Jahan, the emperor famed for building the Taj Mahal, a monument of beauty and grief, a product of the cultural and architectural flowering that defined early Mughal rule. Unlike his father, Aurangzeb showed little interest in opulence. Where Shah Jahan built gardens, Aurangzeb built walls. Where his ancestors ruled through a careful balancing of religions and cultures, Aurangzeb preferred a firmer hand and a narrower path. His ascent to power was as ruthless as it was calculated. After a vicious war of succession, he emerged victorious by imprisoning his father and eliminating his brothers. Once on the throne, he took the title Alamgir, World Caesar, and embarked on a reign that would stretch nearly half a century. It would be the longest of any Mughal emperor and among the most contentious. Aurangzeb viewed his rule as a moral mission. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, which had been abolished by his great-grandfather Akbar in a gesture of imperial inclusivity. He banned court music, sidelined Persian cultural traditions, and promoted Islamic law as the framework for governance. Temples that had been protected under previous emperors were now subject to destruction, repurposing, or closure, particularly if they were associated with political dissent. These weren't merely personal religious choices, they were policies. enforced across a sprawling, diverse empire that had long been home to Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Christians, and Muslims alike. The message was unmistakable. Cultural plurality was no longer a feature of Mughal rule. It was a threat to be corrected. Unsurprisingly, resistance grew. In the Deccan Plateau, in modern-day Maharashtra, Maratha leaders like Shivaji Bhonsle led revolts that would evolve into full-blown warfare. In the north, Sikh leaders who had once coexisted with the empire became militarized in response to increasing hostility. Peasant rebellions erupted. Aurangzeb responded to these challenges with relentless military campaigns that dragged on for decades, consuming enormous resources and manpower. Though he expanded the territory of the Mughal Empire to its greatest physical extent, he also stretched it thin. By the time of his death in 1707, the empire was exhausted, militarily, economically, and spiritually. His successors inherited a kingdom filled with unrest, regional rebellions, and a population increasingly disillusioned with imperial rule. The grand Mughal dream that once fused culture, tolerance, and might had begun to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. Aurangzeb's legacy is still debated across South Asia. Was he a devout reformer who held his empire to higher ideals, or a rigid autocrat who mistook uniformity for unity? Perhaps both. What's certain is that his reign closed a chapter in Indian history, replacing pluralism with polarization and balance with a blade. But if Aurangzeb fought diversity with dogma, the next ruler would wage a campaign of terror on his own people, not for faith, not for conquest, but for legacy, fear, and the sheer assertion of royal dominance. Because next, we march into the battlefield logic of King Shaka Zulu. 27. King Shaka Zulu. Among Africa's most formidable and controversial rulers, King Shaka Zulu is remembered as both a military genius and a leader whose rule, though transformative, bled into tyranny. To this day, his name echoes across southern Africa, evoking awe, pride, and an uneasy silence, because behind the legend of the warrior king lies a reign where innovation marched beside intimidation, and loyalty was demanded with unrelenting intensity. Born around 1787, Shaka was the illegitimate son of a Zulu chief and a mother who was exiled from her tribe. He grew up on the fringes, humiliated, hardened, and perpetually aware of his outsider status. That early isolation forged a deep sense of discipline and a relentless desire to prove himself. When he eventually entered military service under the powerful Mthethwa chief Dingiswayo, Shaka quickly rose through the ranks, not just for his bravery, but for his revolutionary ideas about warfare. And those ideas would change the face of southern Africa. Shaka redesigned the traditional way of fighting. He replaced long throwing spears with short stabbing ones, ikolwa, designed for brutal close-range combat. He introduced rigorous training, organized regiments by age and experience, and enforced discipline with a strictness that bordered on fanaticism. His army moved in tight, fast formations, using a bullhorn formation to surround and destroy enemies. He turned a loose confederation of tribes into a cohesive military machine. Under his command, the Zulu kingdom expanded rapidly. Through conquest, diplomacy, and coercion, Shaka united dozens of clans under a central authority. But unification came at a cost. Resistance was not tolerated. Tribes that refused to join were attacked, displaced, or absorbed by force. The result was a phenomenon historians now call the Mifikein, the crushing or scattering, a period of mass migration, warfare, and upheaval across southern Africa that shattered traditional social structures and destabilized entire regions. Shaka's internal rule was no gentler. He expected absolute obedience, not just from his soldiers, but from his people. He imposed strict codes of conduct. Failure in battle meant death. Disloyalty, real or imagined, was dealt with swiftly. Even personal loss became national theatre. When his mother Nandi died in 1827, Shaka's grief turned into state policy. He ordered public mourning on a scale so extreme that it crossed into the realm of fear. Normal life halted. Thousands were punished for not grieving enough. Some were executed for showing signs of joy or normalcy. By this point, even Shaka's closest allies began to question his judgment. The same methods that built the Zulu state were now being used to tighten control beyond necessity. His paranoia deepened. Trust evaporated. In 1828, his own half-brothers, Dingain and Moklangana, assassinated him, ending a reign that had lasted barely a decade but changed the region forever. Shaka's legacy is as complex as his rule. He forged a powerful Zulu identity, developed military tactics studied for generations, and challenged European perceptions of African governance. But he also ruled through fear, expanded through destruction, and left behind a kingdom defined as much by trauma as by triumph. And where Shaka reorganized society through militarism, the next emperor would do it through religious doctrine, obliterating images, exiling opponents, and turning divine symbolism into imperial enforcement. Because next, we step into the icon-smashing reign of Emperor Constantine V of Byzantium. 28. Emperor Constantine V of Byzantium. In the shadowy corridors of Byzantine history, few emperors have left a legacy as contentious and as deeply polarizing as Emperor Constantine IV. To his supporters, he was a reformer, a protector of the Eastern Roman Empire, and a military leader who stabilized its fragile borders. To his enemies, he was a heretic, a persecutor, and a tyrant whose obsession with religious purity tore through the very fabric of Byzantine society. Born in 718 CE, Constantine V came into the world during a siege. Literally, his birth coincided with the massive Arab siege of Constantinople, and the city's survival was seen by many as divine intervention. That kind of timing would later bolster Constantine's sense of providence, an idea that would shape his reign in ways both strategic and catastrophic. When he assumed the throne in 741, Constantine inherited more than a palace. He inherited a theological civil war. The Eastern Roman Empire was gripped by the fierce and often violent debate over iconoclasm, the rejection and destruction of religious images. His father, Leo III, had already begun the process of outlawing the veneration of icons, arguing that the practice bordered on idolatry and weakened the empire spiritually. Constantine took that movement and turned it into policy, one that reached into monasteries, churches, homes, and even hearts. From 754 onward, under Constantine's leadership, icons were banned not just in public spaces but in private worship. This wasn't a suggestion, it was imperial decree. Churches were stripped of mosaics and frescoes, religious artwork was whitewashed or destroyed, monasteries were raided, relics confiscated, and opposition silenced. The emperor didn't simply enforce iconoclasm, he militarized it. And that was the genius and horror of Constantine V. He saw no boundary between religious conformity and political stability. In his mind, they were the same fight. To challenge the ban on icons was to challenge imperial authority. To revere a painting was, in effect, to commit treason. Resistance was met not with debate, but with exile, imprisonment, and in some cases blinding or mutilation. Tactics that became disturbingly common tools of Byzantine statecraft. It wasn't just about belief, it was about control. Yet while Constantine's religious policies made him a villain in the eyes of later Christian historians, especially those from the pro-icon camp, his military record told a different story. He led numerous successful campaigns against the Bulgars, reorganized the Byzantine army, and built up fortifications across the empire. His administration improved logistics, boosted agricultural productivity, and even undertook public works projects. He was not incompetent, just unrelenting. Even in death, Constantine's reputation split like a cracked mosaic. Among the iconoclasts, he was revered as a saint and hero. Among the iconodules, he was remembered as Copronymus, the dung-named, a deliberate slur that clung to him for centuries. It wasn't enough to condemn his policies. They rewrote his memory. Constantine V died in 775, still convinced he had saved the empire from divine wrath. He left behind an empire more secure in its borders, but fractured in its soul, divided between those who worshipped with images and those who worshipped without. But where Constantine attacked symbols, the next king attacked trust itself, spinning webs of lies, betrayal, and espionage so thick that he earned the nickname the Spider King. Because next, the throne passes to King Louis XI of France. 29. King Louis XI of France. In the theatre of monarchy, some kings roar, some preach, and some, like King Louis XI of France, whisper from behind the curtain. Known as the Spider King, Louis earned his place in the annals of dark statecraft not by swinging a sword, but by pulling strings. He wasn't a warrior in shining armor or a visionary crowned with laurels. He was a chess player who thought 10 moves ahead and wasn't above flipping the board if he didn't like the outcome. Born in 1423 to Charles VII, Louis came of age during the final stages of the 100 Years' War. France was in shambles, its economy drained, its nobility fractured, and its monarchy clinging to legitimacy. As Dauphin, Louis was impatient, ambitious, and openly hostile toward his father. He ran his own miniature court in Dauphiné, plotted against the king, and eventually had to flee France after a failed rebellion. His relationship with his father was so poisonous that when Charles VII was on his deathbed, he was reportedly terrified that Louis might hasten things along. When Louis did ascend the throne in 1461, he inherited a fragile kingdom and immediately set about turning it into a fortress of centralized power. He disbanded lavish court traditions, surrounded himself with bureaucrats rather than nobles, and avoided unnecessary ceremony. Nobles sneered, poets sulked, but Louis wasn't interested in appearances. He was building something. He began undermining the traditional power of the French nobility, many of whom had grown dangerously autonomous during the war years. Through a mixture of bribes, backroom deals, arranged marriages, and calculated betrayals, Louis gradually brought the great houses under royal control. He created a spy network that reached into every noble court and border province. He read correspondence, tracked movements, and manipulated rivals into destroying each other before they could threaten him. His enemies often found themselves outmaneuvered before they even knew they were playing. He also cultivated alliances with the burgeoning merchant class, understanding that a financially stable crown was far more powerful than a ceremonial one. He encouraged trade, supported infrastructure, and rewarded loyalty with tax exemptions rather than titles. The old feudal structure of France began to crack, not from revolution, but from quiet, deliberate erosion. But Louis's reign wasn't just a long bureaucratic game. It was also marked by ruthless decision-making and moral flexibility. He imprisoned his own brother multiple times, then pardoned him when it was convenient. He forged alliances with former enemies, only to betray them once they served their purpose. He wore a simple wool cap instead of a crown, part humility, part mockery, and rarely left his castle without multiple layers of protection, both physical and political. His greatest rival was Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, one of the last great feudal lords. With dreams of independence, Louis played him like a drum. Through lies, diplomacy, and indirect support of rebellious vassals, he weakened Charles until his death on the battlefield. The Duchy of Burgundy was eventually absorbed into the French crown. Louis XI died in 1483, leaving behind a France more united, more centralized, and more paranoid. His enemies called him deceitful, manipulative, even inhuman. His allies called him brilliant, But all agreed on one thing: no one ruled quite like the Spider King. And while Louis wove his web from shadows and secrets, the next ruler staked his legacy on spectacle and fear, impaling enemies not just to defeat them, but to redefine the very concept of terror. Because last, we come face to face with the nightmarish legacy of King Vlad III, the Impaler of Wallachia. 30. King Vlad III. The Impaler of Wallachia history has many villains, but few have left such a vivid, visceral mark on the world's imagination as Vlad III of Wallachia, a man whose real-life brutality was so profound it bled into folklore and gave birth to the legend of Count Dracula. Known to his people as Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, and to his enemies as a terror in human form, Vlad was a ruler who turned cruelty into public policy, fear into a diplomatic strategy, and death into a performance with purpose. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad was the second son of Vlad II Dracul, a nobleman inducted into the secretive chivalric Order of the Dragon, which defended Christianity against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. The younger Vlad inherited his father's title, Dracula, or Son of the Dragon, and a deep resentment towards the empires that had dominated his homeland. Wallachia, a small but strategically crucial principality between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, was not so much ruled as it was constantly fought over. Kings, sultans, and local boyars, nobles, vied for control, often installing puppet rulers only to see them deposed months later. Vlad's early life was shaped by betrayal, held hostage by the Ottomans as a teenager, denied the throne, and repeatedly ousted by his political rivals. By the time he seized power in 1456, Vlad had developed a philosophy of rule that was simple, brutal, and unforgiving: stability through fear. And fear he delivered. To Vlad, mercy was weakness, and weakness was an invitation to chaos. Wallachia had been a land of lawless boyars and external invaders for decades. Vlad set out to reverse that by establishing an iron grip on power. He punished corruption, enforced strict discipline, and eliminated rivals with surgical precision. But what set him apart from other harsh rulers was not the scale of his violence, it was the methodical theatricality of it. He made examples of his enemies, often executing them publicly and in large numbers. Reports from the time speak of forests of corpses lining the roads to his capital, warnings not just to invading armies, but to his own people. These acts weren't spontaneous. They were calculated displays designed to terrify potential traitors and impress foreign dignitaries. For Vlad, power wasn't just exercised, it was advertised. And the strategy worked, for a time at least. Crime reportedly dropped. Boyars who had once plotted endlessly against the throne suddenly found their loyalty unwavering. Even foreign leaders hesitated to provoke him. His enemies in the Ottoman Empire, as well as in Hungary, feared him, and with good reason. Few men wielded vengeance with such precision, but power built on fear rarely lasts. Vlad was eventually betrayed, captured by the Hungarians, and imprisoned for over a decade. He returned briefly to the throne in 1476, only to be killed shortly thereafter, either in battle or by assassination. His head was reportedly sent to the Sultan as proof that the dragon's son had finally fallen. Vlad's legend, however, refused to die. Over the centuries, stories of his rule mutated into myth. Bram Stoker reimagined him as the immortal Count Dracula, merging medieval violence with Victorian horror. And though the real Vlad was no vampire, his reputation had already fed on centuries of rumor, fear, and fascination. He ruled a small kingdom, but cast a long shadow. His methods were terrifying, his reign short, his legacy eternal. And in closing this catalogue of kings, emperors, and queens, we end where all power eventually must, not with law or legacy, but with the unsettling question of what rulers become when the crown no longer serves the people, but demands their submission. Because history does not remember cruelty kindly, it remembers it vividly.